Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and in this video, I'm going to be detailing all of the Final Fantasy XI references that were in the first tier of the Echoes of Vana'diel raids. Now, while I do feel like they've crafted a story that makes sense within Final Fantasy XIV's world, there's also just a ton of stuff here that's clearly for Final Fantasy XI players to go, hey, I understood that reference, so now I'm going to help you understand that reference if you're not someone who played Final Fantasy XI. I've covered some of these things in various individual videos, but this time I'm going to hopefully be getting every single reference that's actually made. I might not focus in on some of the exact ones like certain skills certain enemies use unless I feel like it's an absolute necessity. But I'm going to do my best here, and we've got a lot to get through, so let's go. Before we get too far in though, this video does have a sponsor, Magic Spoon. Honestly, this ad could not be better timed because I'm going to need all of this food on reserve for the content I have planned for the rest of the month. Now listen, I've been increasing my protein a lot over the past couple of years, but sometimes it's tiresome. I don't always want chicken, and I don't always have time to make something more interesting. So that's when I go to grab some Magic Spoon. As a high protein cereal, I can get some good calories in quick with a few handfuls of cereal because I'm kind of an animal, or one of their treat bars, which I devour way too quickly every time I get a box of this. Not to mention, I've got a pretty intense 12 to 16 hour per day schedule coming up, so I gotta be very sure that I have a lot of stuff prepared for it, and having a bunch of Magic Spoon handy is just gonna be what I need. Now, if you'd like to try Magic Spoon while also supporting the channel, then click the link below to get some today. You can build a custom box with cereal or the treat bars, and trust me, you're going to want some of those treat bars. Best of all, use my link and discount code Mr. Happy to get $5 off of your box. You can also buy it at your local grocery store or Amazon, but come on, you want to save $5, don't you? And if you don't like it, Magic Spoon has a 100% happiness guarantee. Let them know and they'll refund you, no questions asked. So click the link below or scan the QR code on the screen and use code Mr. Happy to get $5 off, or go to magicspoon.com/Mr. Happy to save $5 on your order. It even works in Canada and the UK. Thanks again to Magic Spoon for sponsoring, and now on with the video. So right off the bat, Alzal mistakes the Mamool Ja for the ones from Vana'diel and assumes that he's been captured. That's because the Mamool Ja in Final Fantasy XI are quite hostile, even called the Mamool Ja Savages by the Archangel Empire, who are constantly being raided by the Beastmen. The Mamool Ja do live in Mamuk in Final Fantasy XI as well, though it's really more like a series of underground caves with a few huts here or there, and is more military-based than it is just kind of a society that's existing. And of course, they are led by none other than Ru'Aun Gardens, who was actually the one who made the Mamool Ja as aggressive as they are, and has an intense thirst for combat and blood. Now, there is a Surreal Ja and a Boyahda Ja in Final Fantasy XI, though no Boyahda Ja. Surreal Ja is one of the Mamool Ja who invades Ru'Aun during the Besieged content, alongside Ru'Aun Ja himself. He's actually called Thunderclap Surreal Ja and is actually a Beastmaster. Meanwhile, Boyahda Ja is one of the Mamool Ja that also invades Ru'Aun for the Besieged content. He's actually a Dragoon called Strife Lord Boyahda Ja, who summons multiple wyverns to assist him. Now, for Alzal himself, a lot of us thought maybe he was a reference to some of the characters from Sandoria, especially one who's regularly disguising himself as part of various storylines. However, it seems that Alzal is just a fill-in for a random Final Fantasy XI player, not even a stand-in for the main character from Final Fantasy XI who you would have been playing as. He's wearing the Koenig armor set, which was a very popular armor set from endgame content in the earlier days of the game. Speaking of characters, we have Prishe herself, who is the main character from the Chains of Promethea expansion. Now, her special outfit when she's a boss is Final Fantasy XIV exclusive, but after you beat her and she returns to her original outfit is pretty much identical to her Final Fantasy XI one. I go into much more detail about her in my video that is specifically made to cover her character arc. Now, when Prishe's fighting you, she's actually seeing several Taurus mobs being mind-controlled and whatnot. Now, while Final Fantasy XIV has Taurus mobs, Prishe's homeland has aqueducts underneath it filled with Taurus mobs there, hence her familiarity with them. She also mentions her friend Ulmia, who is Prishe's first real friend, a young Elvan woman who becomes essential to the Chains of Promethea storyline. Now, when they teleport away, opening up the entrance to the raid, they use a portal. Now, portals are all over the place in Final Fantasy XI, and there's tons of different ones. However, this one is not the one that is used in the Chains of Promethea content, which you'd figure they'd reference with it being Prishe and all that. Instead, this one is more precisely used as part of Planar Rifts, which is actually part of a content called Void Watch. It's not even used as a portal for you. It actually teleports monsters into the open field for you to fight. Then you actually enter the main raid of Jeuno, the First Walk. We'll talk about the First Walk part later, but Jeuno itself is the main hub of the base game of Final Fantasy XI and is still used to this day. This is Lower Jeuno in particular, though there is of course a port Upper Jeuno and the Ru'Aun Gardens where all of the political figures actually live, as well as the rich people. Again, I cover a lot of this in more detail in my Jeuno walkthrough video that I recorded a few weeks back. Now, this area is strikingly similar to an endgame content from the early days called Dynamis. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. Now, in Final Fantasy XI, Dynamis was an endgame content taking place in a dream world created by Diablos. Now, Jeuno does have a Dynamis in it, but it's not actually in Lower Jeuno. It's in the Ru'Aun Gardens, but Lower Jeuno is far more iconic, hence why they probably wanted to use this here. Now, when you come to the first set of mobs, they actually are some of the Dynamis Jeuno mobs here. The Goblin Replica was something that would basically just walk around. It didn't have a whole lot of health, but could hit incredibly hard. Upon defeating it, you could get HP or MP back, and often pulling one would result in tons of other goblins joining the fray. The Vanguard Pathfinder right behind the Goblin Replica is one such monster, with Vanguard being a common name used for Dynamis mobs. However, this one in particular is a Beastmaster, and they do actually have these jelly-type mobs as pets, though they would normally try to charm the player if those jellies were dead, which doesn't seem to happen here. One thing I noticed right away when going into the raid is how the mob animations are done. For example, mobs that are charging their attacks have a completely different animation than the way Final Fantasy XIV usually does it, with that attack glow that they have and the little sound effect that's like... That's ripped right from Final Fantasy XI and is used to designate a, hey, get out of the way, stun this, interrupt it, whatever you want to do. In fact, there's a frequent use of interrupts in Jeuno the First Walk. It was really common to have players assigned to a stun or interrupt duty in Final Fantasy XI. It was so popular that red mages would actually sub Dark Knight and chain spell stun bosses to prevent them from acting while parties zerged them down, a strategy that would become very popular in the mid to late 2000s. After you deal with the Prishe boss fight, you are teleported to the Boyahda tree, which was a dangerous high-level area in the early parts of the game. It's a popular leveling location and the pathway to the Dragon's Eyrie where Fafnir resides. One of the more known monsters in that area is indeed Aquarius. It spawns when robber crabs are killed in certain locations, taking the place of one when it respawns. This is actually known for killing off leveling parties when pulled by accident, as the robber crabs were popular EXP mobs along with some of the other stuff in the area. Now here it has 100 Fists and water spells, which it didn't actually have in Final Fantasy XI. It did have an incredibly fast attack speed and was able to deal additional water damage on its attacks. So those two things are basically being substituted here with actual skills. It also dropped an axe called the Francisca, which of course is not going to be referenced here, but it's at least worth mentioning for the sake of the reference. There's also another party running through, and this just emulates the social features of Final Fantasy XI. You could be going to any location for any such thing, and you can find other people who might have been running past to go to a different location, or were also looking for a leveling location that was open and available. So it's nice to see them just kind of having that social feature represented here. Then you get to Fafnir, who, like I said, would reside in the Dragon's Eyrie, which is where this is taking place at the top of the tree. Now, Fafnir I've made an entire video about, but it was basically an endgame boss that would spawn once every 21 to 24 hours after being previously defeated. It could occasionally respawn as Nidhogg once every 3 to 8 days, and was one of the most sought-after endgame bosses for its loot in those early days. One of those major pieces was the Riddle. It was a sword dropped by Fafnir and is later referenced by the Hume Adventure in Jeuno, and even given a little bit of backstory. After clearing through Fafnir, you are teleported to the Ru'Aun Gardens. This was the endgame area of the Rise of Xylart expansion, home to many powerful bosses and the end of the Rise of Xylart story. The community would dub it Sky, as opposed to Chains of Prometheus' final area, which would be dubbed Sea. Some of the most dangerous bosses here were the gods, Byakko, Seiryu, Suzaku, Genbu, and of course, Kirin. As you're running up the pathway, you'll have mobs accost you from the alcoves on the side, and this is a mechanic that actually exists in the Ru'Aun Gardens. They're technically sight aggro mobs, and you're just getting within their sight range, which aggroes them, though a lot of the mobs here do aggro by magic, including these ones as well. Before you're shipped off to fight the archangels, you will run into Despot, which was an often camped notorious monster near the entrance to Ru'Aun Gardens. It spawns from the gatekeepers that come out of those alcoves, and upon defeating one and Despot saying, hey, I guess it's my time, he'll actually find you and hunt down the group that actually killed the groundskeeper that caused him to appear. Interestingly enough, Despot does play for another reference here, as Despot drops an item that is required to spawn Byakko. That plays into this because the first of the 3 notes that you can find on the ground mentions a player swearing they're going to get their Byakko Hadeite today. Now, Byakko dropped a leg piece that had haste and dexterity on it that was one of the most coveted drops from this zone for many, many years to come, rarely dropping off of Byakko. I actually got a pair to drop when I was getting footage for this video. Not that I need them anymore, but hey, it's nice. The second note mentions Veluganan Palace as an area underneath the outer areas of Ru'Aun Gardens. Now, the doorways from this note, it mentions that they walked up to there and they didn't see a way in. And that's because they looked like closed doors until approached, hence the note's confusion. Players often mixed up which entrances led where, and one had to be passing through to get to Byakko, so it definitely led to a lot of getting lost, especially with the copy-paste nature of the maps back in Final Fantasy XI. The same type of door can actually be seen when approaching the Layloft Amphitheater, where you're going to fight the archangels in this raid. And the third note just mentions that there are 5 separate bosses and you wouldn't want to fight them together alone. This is likely referring to the archangel fight you're about to go into and how you could fight all 5 of the archangels separately or in a dedicated encounter called Divine Might, where you would team up with 17 other players for a total of 18 in hopes of getting some unique loot to that specific quest. Now, the Archangels themselves are a boss from the Rise of Xylar expansion storyline. This particular version is that Divine Might, which rewards an incredibly powerful earring for completing the quest. Now, almost all of the moves the Archangels have in Final Fantasy XI are reimagined here in various ways, except for one that I noticed was missing. Now, I've actually covered all of the Archangels and all of their unique skills in 11, but I might as well re-reference them here. Archangel Gulka's Dragonfall was a weapon skill in 11, albeit it just did an AoE bind on top of a ton of damage. His Mekyo Shisui caused him to perform Tachi Yukikaze, Gecko, and Kasha, 3 samurai weapon skills in rapid succession, which he does here. This forms the Fragmentation and Light skill chain, special attacks that occurred when proper weapon skills were used within a certain time frame. These opened up enemies to take increased damage from specific elements called magic bursts. And Gulka was capable of doing this as well as the player, so he would usually open up some skill chains on the tank. The Mithra uses mostly basic axe weapon skills, and her dashing around for Rampage may be a homage to her perfect dodge thief skill in Final Fantasy XI. However, her Beastmaster traits are pretty non-existent here. Havoc Spiral, though, was her special attack in Final Fantasy XI. Tarutaru teleporting around and trying to cast Meteor are 2 things he did often in Final Fantasy XI. Now, Guillotine is just a basic scythe weapon skill that didn't work anything like this, although the sound effect and animation are definitely something they carried over. His signature attack, however, Amon Drive, appears to be missing, unless there's just like maybe a chance if he's the last one alive he can do it. I don't know, I've never seen it in the multiple runs that I've done, even with basically telling everyone to stop hitting the enemies and just waiting. So maybe they just left it out because they didn't want Amon Drive. You know, that name means something very different here, but I don't know. If it's there, then that's a reference too. Now, Hume was a ninja and a warrior and uses both of their signature skills here. Uses the warrior 2-hour mighty strikes, causing all of his attacks to be critical hits. Now, Utsusemi is a ninja ability in Final Fantasy XI that basically gives them shadows that prevent them from taking damage, such as single target magic or most physical attacks. Here, of course, it makes the clones that then chase you down, which is a very different thing. And his Big Enrage mechanic, where he's being protected by Archangel Elvan, Mijingakure, is the original ninja 2-hour ability, exploding the ninja and dealing damage. Now, his doesn't kill him, something that also happened in his Final Fantasy XI fight, where he would basically wipe you out with this kamikaze and then just get up and say, no, actually, I won, haha. Also, like in this fight, Mijingakure is also known for wiping parties. Cross Reaver, which he does use here, is also his signature attack in 11. Now, the Elvan is a paladin and a white mage and uses her invincible skill in this fight to protect the Hume during the Mijingakure cast, which is an alternate take on the paladin skill from 11, which was like a 30-second physical invuln. She uses her signature Dominion Slash, which was an AoE silence and potentially a dispel in Final Fantasy XI, but in this version it just places various danger puddles around the room. Her use of white magic coincides with that white mage job as well. After you clear through all of the archangels, you are taken briefly to the throne room of Castles of Vol. This would normally have no music, but they really wanted to include the Castles of Vol music, so they included for just a few seconds. This is the Shadow Lord's castle up in Zarkabar, the Northlands area where a lot of bad stuff happens. It's filled with many beastmen and demons even. The Shadow Lord himself was actually the final boss of the base game, required to increase your rank with your home city-state to 6 and unlock the Rise of Xylard expansion. I'm not going to get too in-depth with his backstory, as it's again one of those things I made an entirely separate video for. Some really old heads of 11 may not actually recognize his armor though, which is part of his appearance in the Wings of the Goddess expansion, set during the Crystal War where the Shadow Lord first began terrorizing Vana'diel. Now, upon actually clearing the raid, you're going to hear a song that's known notoriously as the Vana'diel March, which is actually the game's original login music. It wouldn't be replaced for many years after, but I believe you can still change the settings to bring it back. Then we get to Lower Jeuno, and pretty much everything here is some sort of reference. When you first enter, on the right-hand side will be the auction house. This is kind of a market board equivalent for Final Fantasy XI, except that its mechanics work entirely different. Items are put up for a blind bid value, and any player who bids at least the minimum value simply gets the item. This means that all the undercutting is kind of done in secret, and people who understand what the bidding patterns look like will either change what they put the item up for, to try and game the system, and people who are, used to playing the game will try to get an item for slightly cheaper instead of just going for whatever the last few sales were. On the left is the Chamber of Commerce and Industry. In lore, it's supposed to help people find work in Jeuno, but the NPCs present perform a ton of different functions that old players are probably familiar with. As for the NPCs, let's start with any of the shade-looking ones first, whether they have names or not. The Orderly Shade is the tutorial NPC right in front of the auction house, and he just taught players what it did. Going over to the fountain, there's a small NPC by the name of Rakoru, known for giving the player a lengthy quest that rewards 59,630 gil. This reward is a bit of a joke, where the numbers 5963 in Japanese are pronounced Gokuro-san, which sounds similar to a word that basically means like good job for the hard work. The taller NPC next to them is just a random adventurer that's looking to buy a teleport. Now, Final Fantasy XI took forever to get anywhere, so players purchased teleport taxis from others, where they'd pay them to teleport to specific locations on the map. Teleport May, the one the person is looking for, is situated closest to Windurst, one of the base city-states. 1,000 gil was the price they were willing to pay, which was a normal price in the very early days, but it wasn't long before it became 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, I remember even 5,000 at one point. And the Can I Have It would actually be the auto-translate that most people would use in their shouts. The final NPC by the fountain all the way to the side is an NPC named Momiji, who spends her time recounting time with her lover, who is likely not her actual husband. It's suspected she simply regrets marrying the man she has and wishes she'd married someone from her youth. Just past the fountain, as you make your way towards the inside of Lower Jeuno, there's actually a patrolling NPC there named Zuako, who just patrols back and forth in the same spot. People like to AFK around them, and so he's here. Now, as you make your way over to the stairs that lead above the auction house, you'll run into a Solemn Shade, which is actually just a player that is looking for a party. Since the game didn't have proper matchmaking, players would simply set up a flag and change their search comment, sometimes shouting in town for members. He has 3 DPS, so he's probably feeling a struggle right now. If you step into the door next to the Solemn Shade, you'll actually enter the building called the Neptune Spire, where you'll run into a Thrifty Shade. Now, the Neptune Spire is a shop in Lower Jeuno that's not so secretly the base of the Tenshodo, a black market organization. This NPC had a hidden dialogue option to join the Tenshodo once the player was famous enough in Jeuno, which then required you to provide a Tenshodo invite, which is all referenced here by the NPC. Stepping back outside and going up the stairs, you will find 2 different shadows, and they're attempting to complete a nearby quest, where players are given 5 tarot cards of the same kind and must trade them with other players to obtain a full set. I call them tarot cards instead of tarot cards because it's T-A-R-U-T here instead of with the O-T, so, don't knock my head off for that one. The other 2 shades up here, one of them named, one of them not, are actually also part of this tarot card quest and actually have a sister quest that converges for a very popular reward back in the day. The diminutive shade is an NPC named Chululu, who actually gives the tarot card quest that those NPCs are doing. Once completed, she could determine your compatibility with other players if they were nearby. The unnamed nearby shop shade is an NPC named Kuromuro. His quest series also unlocked a compatibility option, and when you did both his and Chululu's quest lines together, you would eventually be led to the Sleepga 2 quest, a highly coveted and rare spell that for a long time could only be obtained through this quest or buying one off of someone else who did the quest and decided to sell it. Nowadays, it can just be purchased from an NPC. Back down the stairs, we find the Peculiar Goblin, which in Final Fantasy XI is an NPC called Sweepstocks, who would actually reward players with random items when exchanging a currency called Daily Tally, which is given automatically to the player after unlocking it every day. It often rewards trash, but also has some of the game's most coveted items as available. Our few remaining shades are actually in the Chamber of Commerce itself, which if you step into, has a handful of them at a couple of counters. The Cordial Shade is actually an NPC named Derek. He actually starts the famous Clock Tower quest in Jeuno and can sell the player their airship pass for 500,000 gil, allowing them to use the airship, which we'll talk about briefly in this video later. This can also be obtained by reaching rank 5 with any city-state, and almost nobody actually purchased it. At the other counter, there's a left shade and a right shade. The left shade is an NPC named Promirov, which I'm sure I'm pronouncing wrong. They sell maps to the players so they can actually see the zone layouts as they travel. Yeah, you didn't unlock the maps as you went or as you discovered them. You had to buy maps or find them out in the world. Nowadays, you can buy almost every map from this NPC, and some of the more obscure methods aren't really required anymore. The right shade is an NPC named Darcia. Gives the player a quest that allows them to travel to Adulin, the settlement where the Seekers of Adulin expansion takes place. You can also pay them 1,000,000 gil for the item or obtain it from the Rhapsodies of Vana'diel storyline. Funny thing about Seekers of Adulin, it was actually released in 2013 and was developed after 1.0, for 14 at least, after 1.0 didn't go so well. Now we get to the actual adventurers that are around the map, which all encompass the different races that are available in Final Fantasy XI. Right next to the Chamber of Commerce is the Elvon Adventurer, who I hate to admit, I actually forgot to speak to them when I went through the footage. Sorry. His outfit is a Vermilion Cloak, which is obtainable through the Eureka content in Final Fantasy XIV. His staff is a Light Staff, which is one of 8 elemental staves mages needed to empower their spells. The pants, I think, are Noble Slacks, which were a really popular leg piece, and unfortunately, I don't recognize the boots. You all know glam's not my specialty. The other NPC next to the Chamber of Commerce is the Hume Adventurer, who's wearing the Ares armor set, which drops from the Ottergon content known as Salvage, which is why it's funny that he says he salvaged it from the Alzadal Undersea Ruins. And yes, the Alzadal Undersea Ruins from the patch 6.1 dungeon are indeed also a Final Fantasy XI reference. Actually, the remains of Alexander from the first occurrence of Ragnarok, where he battled Odin. Yeah, a lot of lore there. Now, if you actually walk past the patrolling shade and into the little alcove where you get cut off, you'll find a Mithrin adventurer who was just part of the party you saw in Boyahda Tree. Just kind of a nice little social thing that happens. Be like, oh yeah, I saw you in there. Wow, it's so cool. I hope you had good luck. Just kind of mimicking the social aspects of Final Fantasy XI. Now, they're wearing an optical hat, scorpion harness, and strider boots. All armor that's available in Eureka, Onimos, and Pagos. By Glam, of course. The legs, I think, are the rogue culottes, and the hands are rogue armlets, thief artifact gear in 11. The dagger could be one of many, Blaudolch, Misericord, Hornet Needle, but I don't recall the little lipped edge in there, which reminds me more of the Adaman Chris. Maybe they just took a little liberty with this, but maybe I also just need to see the actual models in 11, which I wasn't able to do. And unfortunately, there was no Tarutaru Adventurer to fill out all of the races. Guess they thought they might be hard to find. Though to be fair, I guess there's also no Galkan Adventurer, so I guess they just wanted to start with this. Maybe we'll run into the rest when we go through the second raid. Maybe they were just saving it for later. Speaking of race, when you go to advance the story, Prishe will make a comment based on your character's race, comparing it to the Final Fantasy XI equivalent, if there is one. Stuff like Viera, Auron, Hrothgar all get a separate comment, including female Rugadin, which there is no female equivalent of the Galka in Final Fantasy XI. They were genderless, they just reproduced asexually. Probably the one that gets a chuckle the most out of Final Fantasy XI players is if you are a male Makote, in which he says, "A male Mithra? Now I've seen it all," in reference to the fact that male Mithras were not playable in Final Fantasy XI and only one was ever seen in any part of the game. Male Mithras are so well protected and so rare that they basically send out a hit squad to retrieve any that get away from the Mithran homeland in lore. So if they get out, they try to stay out, but they normally don't succeed. Now, Prishe also makes regular mention of a he or she character, similar to how our character's relationship to Azem is usually discussed. Now, the Warrior of Light in 11 doesn't really take on that level of important role until Rhapsodies of Vana'diel, the game's swan song, but it'll be interesting to see how they try to tie the games together versus building on Vana'diel lore. Now, as you advance the story, Ru'Aun Ja shows you a bunch of images of places from Final Fantasy XI. These same images are actually featured in the game's original guidebook and are often used in other promotional material online. As for what each location is, let's go through them. So, Lethene Plateau will be the first one that we talk about. It's a low-level area, and that rainbow you see actually occurs in-game whenever a player unlocks the Summoner job, as its final quest finishes in that zone. Then we have Saruta Baruta over here. These towers lead to the Horutoto ruins, ancient ruins that contain the Full Moon Fountain, home of Fafnir. There is so much more lore to that I am not getting into right now because it's not relevant to the picture. Then you have Northern Gustaberg, one of the areas outside of Bastok, and that bridge is actually the final landmark before leaving the zone as you adventure out into the rest of the world and is incredibly iconic to Bastokan players. The waterfall in the back is also a popular landmark for both quests and the game's start screen. And if you're leaving through Northern Gustaberg, you're probably heading to Valkyrie Dunes. This is the first major level zone where players group up, usually around level 10. It's infamous for early game players falling victim to deadly goblins aggroing as they walk past and training them all the way back to the zone lines. It's also known for its below average quality of party, as new players are here and learning the game and it'll be their first time grouping up. So they may not have very good equipment and they may not even understand how to properly group up with other players just yet. It's also a place where a ton of major features unlock, one such quest being the sub-job quest, which will be referenced later in this video. But speaking of which, in Valkyrie Dunes, the next picture is Selbina, the port town that's located there. It's home to many popular quests and one of two locations the base game had connected by boat. This boat took 15 minutes to get to and from each location, with players able to fish and even fight enemies on the boat. However, it featured deadly new player traps, such as the dangerous sea horror Notorious Monster, and even pirates that would attack the boat. Now, jumping very far away is a picture of Zarkabard, which is the heart of the Northlands where Castle Zaval, the Shadow Lord's compound, resides. In fact, this image is taken from right outside the entrance to Castle Zaval. The next three images are each from the starting city-states of Final Fantasy XI. The first one in the top right is Sandoria, and this is actually the fountain in northern Sandoria, probably its most notable landmark. This is where the Elvons would live, and if you actually played an Elvon character and made it starting city Sandoria, you would for free obtain a bonus ring at level 1. In the bottom left, we have the Heaven's Tower, which is located in the starting city of Windurst. Heaven's Tower is one of the most beloved landmarks in the entire game and has a theme that everybody who plays the game is in love with or did love when they played it. Similar to with the Elvons back in Sandoria, if you started as a Tarutaru or a Mithra in Windurst, you would also obtain different bonus rings. Finally, we have the city-state of Bastok, in which they decided to include an image of the port, again, one of the most notable landmarks in Bastok. You see, Port Bastok is where the airships would fly in and out of, and if you were a player on the drawbridge as the airships were coming and going, you would actually get a cutscene pushing you off of it so that the airship could pass. Or if you weren't on the drawbridge and needed to cross, you'd have to wait till the airship animation was done, which is realistically just a few seconds. And again, similar to the other two city-states, if you started in Bastok as either a Hume or a Galka, you would again receive a bonus starting ring. And that's going to be it for the images, and while Ru'Aun Ja does mention something I have to reference a little bit later, I'm going to save that for closer to the end. Now, when a lot of you actually get back to Tuliolal, you're going to get tacos, and Prishe is actually from the nation of Tavnasia, and their most famous food were their tacos, which was actually a tank food in Final Fantasy XI, one of the most popular ones. This is actually a seafood taco in Final Fantasy XI, though. Now, as you're walking to go get your tacos, there's a bunch of different dialogue. The first is the alpaca dialogue, where they talk about, oh, I can't believe people would ride these. You know, do you guys have chocobos too? And talk about renting a chocobo and how great it was to use them to get around. You had to rent chocobos for a very long time in Final Fantasy XI, and they would only last a limited time and couldn't go to a lot of locations. So you couldn't just get back on your chocobo when you got off of it. You'd have to go back to town or find a porter that was somewhere out in the wild. You could eventually raise your own, but it was kind of a pain, and they weren't even as good as the rental chocobos for the most part, and you couldn't summon them infinitely. But nowadays, there's just mounts. So just foregoing all that, we just have mounts of all kinds in 11 nowadays. As you walk past the Gornatruk Gleam Sands, it reminds Alzal of Valkland Dunes and that sub-job quest I mentioned earlier. The Man Out on the Docks refers to the quest giver of the sub-job quest that was actually in Selbina. And the items you needed were a damselfly worm from the damselflies, a magic skull from the ghouls and wights that you could find, as well as a crab apron from the crabs in Valkland Dunes. There was a second sub-job quest NPC, but they were almost never used. Almost everyone used the one in Selbina instead. As you're walking through the market, Alzal actually points out that there are goblins that are running the marketplaces, which was something you could find in Vana'diel, especially in Jeuno. Also, he remembers the enemy goblins in the wild who would, and I quote, gather in droves and give chase to adventurers. Now, in the early days of Final Fantasy XI, monsters rarely lost sight of their quarry and would often follow them all the way until they reached the next zone lines, if the player even lived that long. They would then aggro tons of more goblins along the way, or whatever monster was chasing you, and then they would just all be brought to where everybody else was hanging out by the zone line. And on top of that, they didn't actually despawn when they were done. They would try to walk back to their initial spawn location very slowly and aggro any other adventurer who walked by in the process, which would then have that player attempt to escape by walking through the zone line and lock the goblins there for God knows how long. Unless a high-level player came by and knocked them out of the way, Valkyrm Dunes could become an absolute just instant death for any player walking into the zone. It was generally a good idea to see if people were leaving or if a lot of people were on the other side of the zone line if you were about to go in before walking out, because either you're going to die and potentially lose some experience or even a level, or you're going to reset the train and everyone's going to be like, not again. Ugh. Now, once you actually go to get your tacos, which Prishe is in love with, Prishe has a few flashbacks and shows some Chains of Promethea areas while mentioning the Crystal Ward with the Shadow Lord. The top image is the Mizarau Coast, the bottom left is Lufay's Meadows, and the bottom right is the Tavnasian Safehold, where the survivors of the Crystal War fled to after the orc attacks. On that note, I'd like to correct a statement I made in the Prishe video. I had totally forgotten the Sandoria questline explaining that the WMD the orcs were blamed for in Tavnasia was actually a Sandorian weapon meant to corral and eliminate all the orcs in a single blow, with Tavnasia just being considered expendable in this case. And I think that's all the references. The little bit where all of the people from Tural are going through Jeuno, that's all, you know, Turalan dialogue, and the auctioning isn't even how Final Fantasy XI auctioning worked. It's more like how a proper auction works. So there's not really any references I could find. Maybe I missed one somewhere in the dialogue. There's another like he-she moment with Prishe where she refers to Azem. You learn Alzal had actually fought alongside the main character, the Warrior of Light in 11, but there's not any actual references. The one real remaining one is that Ru'Aun Ja mentions what he saw in the Walk of Echoes. Now, the Walk of Echoes was featured in the Wings of the Goddess expansion and was basically the equivalent to our Ethereal Sea. It connected all versions of Vana'diel together, although it would still take a lot longer to explain it, but it's not the same type of Vana'diel shards as our shards are. The entire mechanic of it working was just very different. But it does leave the open-ended bit of, is Vana'diel a shard? Did he actually just see another world, a la the interdimensional rift and the way it's treated in the Dissidia series? Those are all questions we still don't have. If you saw the real Vana'diel or one of the shards of the source of Aetheris is Vana'diel itself. That's one of the questions we have left open-ended, and I'm going to leave it open-ended because it would be arrogant of me to assume that it's one or the other, even though I was definitely arrogant about it before the raid actually came out. Although Surreal Jaw actually does have one more reference. He actually mentions at the very end, he's looking for the strength of the ancients to give Mamool Ja. And given that he's actually in the Ru'Aun Gardens, where the Rise of Xylard expansion takes place, the brothers, the Xylardian brothers, Camlanot and Ealdnark, the two antagonists from that expansion, might be used. Although it'd be kind of weird because with there's two of them, would he just make Mamool Ja Ealdnark? Or would he split the head of Resolve and the head of Reason and make Camlanot and Ealdnark? Or do we get some like messed up fusion between the two? I hope it's not the last one because that's going to be horrifying, but I don't know. It just seems like something he might do. Although I have a feeling I know what'll happen in the third raid in regards to Mamool Ja, but I'll leave that for another video. All right, and unless I want to go through individual attacks used by like the darters and the Fafnir fight, which are indeed their moves, just assume almost every move you saw is a move that's also used, and unless I made specific note of it, it's not really worth mentioning here. But yeah, there's technically more references that I don't need to get into, or I went into in detail in one of the other videos that, yeah, it's already a lot, and it took a lot to get all this footage or to find it on my channel or to re-record it or whatever, so I think this is good. I think we're there, and hopefully you understand the references that are being made here at least a little bit more, a lot of bit more. Yeah. But thanks for sticking through this entire video. Be sure to like and subscribe and stay tuned. I'll probably be doing some more 11 related stuff on the channel since Dawn Trail seems to be loving that stuff. And a lot of you are curious about it. So anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, take care.